Okay, I've talked about the rise of remote work before, but let's see how these factors play out in a developing country. I have this article up from the BBC, and it's Can Brazil's Remote Workers Thrive Outside Big Cities? And it's talking about how the phenomenon of remote work plays out in a developing country like Brazil with different conditions. There's poor quality internet, even in some of the smaller cities, and there's different qualities of infrastructure in general. And so they're going to talk about how this plays out. While remote work is automatically going to have major effects immediately in the most advanced countries, in more developing countries there are different factors. For example, in poorer countries, a majority of people don't even own computers, and you can't even begin to do remote work until you own computers. So that's going to stop remote work from playing out to any significant degree for a while. Now, if owning a computer shifts from being a pure consumer good to being a capital expenditure that leads to higher incomes and pays for itself, people will start obtaining them at lower levels of income, and also prices of laptops and computers will continue to go down. So I don't think this will be a factor in 10 to 15 years, but until that point, it will continue to be a hindrance to the widespread adoption of remote work in the poorest countries for the next 10 to 15 years. So these shifts won't play out on the same scale as developed countries. They can't even begin to play out for the next 10 to 15 years. Okay, the next obstacle I want to talk about is that there's lower quality internet in general in poor and middle-income countries. Now, again, over the next 10 to 15 years, I'm pretty sure the quality of internet in even rural areas in the poorest country will increase significantly, and the internet in small cities in middle-income countries will probably be just as good as it is in the biggest cities in the most developed countries today. But again, that will take 10 to 15 years to play out, and in the meantime, it would also serve as a hindrance to the widespread adaptation of remote work. And the third factor in developing countries that makes them different from high-income countries is that a much larger proportion of their jobs and occupations are industry, manufacturing, and more basic services that require in-person interaction. Like things like clerks and cashiers, rather than higher level services that are more readily adaptable to remote work. So that will continue to be a hindrance indefinitely until those countries reach similar levels of development. So unlike the first two factors, I don't think this factor will cease to be a major issue in 10 to 15 years and will just continue to play out indefinitely. Now, the profiles of developing countries vary widely. In upper middle income countries like Mexico and Brazil, where they've already essentially completed urbanization, the effects of remote work in the short term will be a lot more similar to developed countries. However, in really poor countries like African countries or, say, Nepal, for example, there really won't be any major effects from the rise of remote work that those countries will see for like another 20 years. So all these factors vary. Anyway, now that I've got that out of the way, let's get into the article. The pandemic has led many to swap urban living and working for more rural environments. But what happens when you try to do it in a developing nation? Leonardo di Azevedo, I'm sorry, I completely mispronounced that, decided to move to the countryside with his wife and two small children in May. The family ended up in a rural area, Lumiore, near the city of Nova Friburgo, about 90 miles from the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. In general, you're better moving to the outskirts of a smaller city rather than moving to a completely rural area in the middle of nowhere. But that's just my 2 cents. Where Zervedo works in the public prosecutor's office. The idea was to get closer to nature allow the children more freedom, and seek greater security against the pandemic. But the region has no broadband internet, leaving him dependent on mobile internet that came with speed and data limits. Yes, so rural areas in developing countries have really bad internet, and the internet in even in smaller cities in middle-income countries is hit or miss. Maybe it's reasonably good, or maybe it's pretty bad. It's, again, as I said, hit or miss. It's iffy. And when his son had an accident and had to go to A&E, we found that in Nova Friburgo, no service accepted our health plan. He knew that the infrastructure of a smaller city was not going to match Rio de Janeiro, but his family were going crazy holed up in an apartment during the pandemic. Moving the family was worth the challenge, having identified a place to run away to. They filled the car with food and took the leap. They are not alone. Reports are emerging across the globe of workers shifting from big cities to smaller hubs as COVID-19 normalizes remote work. Most attention is focused on the US or Europe, where smaller cities generally have the facilities to welcome new residents and allow them to work while enjoying a better environment. Yet in Brazil and other developing countries, the reality of such a move can be far from a simple transition. Smaller cities often lack basic infrastructure to accommodate the new arrivals, making for a complicated adjustment. Given how rapidly shifts have occurred, it's too early to pin down the exact extent to which professionals are migrating out of major cities. But there's evidence that many want to. In August, 50% of 7,000 adults surveyed in Japan said they would prefer not to live in Tokyo post-pandemic. In the US, 50% of more than 2,000 workers said they would consider moving to a place with a commute of 35 minutes or longer. The OECD's Job Creation and Local Economic Study, released in August, predicts that urbanization could screech to a standstill, as the increased use of teleworking in the future may slow down, even start to reduce its concentration. Again, I think people will relocate to the exurbs of smaller cities rather than move to completely rural areas. So I don't think urbanization per se will stop, but concentrations in dense downtown areas in a big, major metropolitan megacities will definitely decrease. But in developing countries, the best resources may be concentrated in major cities, leaving smaller hubs ill-equipped for an influx of new remote workers. The main thing is certainly infrastructure, and this can also mean features of IT reliability and speed. I would also see safety, mobility, housing, schooling, healthcare as major issues, says Werner Eschweiss, a professor of Germany's Institute of Labor Economics. In Brazil, there's currently a clear shift of mostly liberal professionals and workers employed in big companies to home working, says Alan Carla Fonseca, CEO at a consulting firm on developing and creative economies. I cannot pronounce that. It's hard to estimate numbers because the trend is very remote, but it is a phenomenon led by professions and generally high socioeconomic levels. This is feeding into a trend that already existed of people moving to the countryside, explains Danielle Laborio, a lawyer and professor at Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, where she coordinates the Urban Environmental Research Group. This migration has become more visible and consistent since the pandemic, she says. It's a trend and irreversible. Again, looking at a upper middle income country like Brazil, where urbanization has already reached occurred full scale and reached full scale levels of top occurrence, is going to be interesting because it's going to be more similar to a developed country. While in a lower income country like India, where urbanization has not been completed to a nearly as full-scale level and has not reached peak levels like Brazil, the impact will be less noticeable and less pronounced. In fact, both Fonseca and Libero are taking the leap themselves, moving out of Sao Paulo to smaller cities within 100 kilometers of the capital. The borough says she found it hard to find a house because properties were being purchased and rented quickly throughout the region by people wanting to leave major cities. So again, there's going to be a redistribution of people locating in central downtown areas and in the major, largest urban and metropolitan areas to smaller regional cities. So they're going to move outside the main megacities into smaller, more provincial regional cities. But they're not going to decamp completely for full rural areas. As I was saying, I think will happen. The many roadblocks. Yet these smaller cities may not be ready for new residents. Arthur Whitecracker, professor at Sao Paulo State University, explains that while workers have been moving to smaller Brazilian cities since the 90s, there has been no improvement in infrastructure, equipment, and public services in most of the cities that have received this type of migration. The core need for remote work is reliable internet, and even larger Brazilian cities face issues with low speed, lag, and untrustworthiness. Connections. While some smaller cities, especially in the state of Sao Paulo, and in some states in the northeast, have achieved good connectivity because the small startups have introduced fiber, much needs to be done in rural areas in places further away from centers, according to the data from CETIC. Where I have spent these months, the internet does not work well. It is unstable, low data flow, and mainly subject to nature issues. If there is a storm, the internet stops working, and sometimes it takes hours to get back. Transport between smaller and larger cities can be far from ideal, a potential issue for workers needing to travel occasionally to a city-based HQ. Moving to a small town means you will have to have a car, something that in big cities Then there's housing itself. In Brazil, there is strong gated community culture. Yet there are issues in terms of how these complexes impact on host cities. It's a huge burden of infrastructure demand for cities, especially smaller ones. There are large enterprises that often rely on things like water, sewage, or even the electricity network that were not designed to cope with such high localized demand. In many smaller cities, the electric grid is of poor quality and it ends up in some way hindering remote or internet access. Moreover, the influx of new residents in general tends to put pressure on public services like education, healthcare, that small cities struggle to alleviate. Typically, when high-earning remote workers move to less developed areas, it has a significant economic and cultural effect, something that is especially true in developing countries. Earlier experience with digital nomads in some places in Southeast Asia and expat in general worldwide rather point to the expat bubble experience with more self-constrained, high-expenditure lifestyle that generates income for local economies but also leads to price increases, in particular regarding housing. One difference in developing countries is that there are fewer wealthy suburbs, something common in the US and not so common in Brazil, says Danielle Moria, a professor of economics at the University of California. This implies that relocations are likely to be temporary, as infrastructure in those places do not have the supply of services, including internet, for a permanent move. Many of the workers relocating out Brazil's major hubs are selecting places where some infrastructure is already in place. As again, that's one of the reasons why, though people will move out of the largest major metropolitan areas into smaller cities, and they'll probably move out of the denser city centers into the more sparsely populated exurbs of smaller cities. They won't completely move to outright rural areas, and will still stay in areas that are cities, the metropolitan areas of small cities, rather than completely leave to fully rural areas. Many of the workers relocating out Brazil's major hubs are selecting places where some infrastructure is already in place. However, something that Maria Encarnecao Spotso, a professor at UNESP, suggests could lead to cities that will win and cities that will lose. Where improvements are seen, they can occur selectively, well-equipped areas become better equipped, and other sectors of the city remain in deficit, she says. E. Horst emphasizes that we're still in the early stages of understanding the shift, and it's too early to tell how it might play out, yet there's plenty of evidence suggesting people want to move if they can. For Ku Chinlato, a banking sector worker who relocated with his family to a housing complex with leisure facilities in Boituva, about 100 kilometers from Sao Paulo, the challenges of his new environment were not enough to dissuade him. Like Zervado, he expected fewer facilities and services than he was used to in Sao Paulo. His internet connection is worse, and he's found it hard to find supermarkets with the same range of products as in the capital. But he says he's now living in a healthier environment, in a bigger house, in an area with a much lower cost of living. And he says some local services are adopting to new residents. The city's delivery services are adjusting quickly, he says. Well, I would expect remote work the phenomenon to occur best within developing countries, in the upper middle income countries that have already achieved full urbanization and already have income levels that are a lot closer to developing countries. So, of course, you'd expect the dynamics to work more similar in a place like Brazil than in a less developed country like India or South Africa. Well, that's it for the article.